Brilliant, thanks Andy. Yeah, so what we're going to start with here is we're going to do a bit of a comparison really between the remote desktop services architecture, whether you built it in Azure, I suppose, or on-premise as well. It probably doesn't change that much. And then sort of go into looking at how the Azure Virtual Desktop architecture is different. The reason we do that is just because a lot of people are familiar with RDS, and I'm guessing a lot of people are using it already. If not, they definitely will be aware of it. So we're just going to talk about the main components that are involved in an RDS sort of setup and architecture. So what we've got initially is you obviously need some level of or some method of authentication. That's typically using an Active Directory domain controller, or probably multiple of them for redundancy. Then you need somewhere to store your profiles and for all your RDS users, and that's typically done on some form of file server or distributed file system cluster, which would host those profiles. And then we've got, obviously, you need some sort of applications to actually serve through your remote desktop solution. So you might be your ERP system, accounting system, whatever these applications are that you guys want to actually host or publish to your users. Will have their own sort of infrastructure requirements as well. So that might be a database server or some web services or application services. Yeah, that'll just be different depending obviously what you require. So that's always going to be there. Obviously, then we've got the remote desktop host, which are actually the hosts that serve user sessions. So typically that would be like a farm of multiple hosts, you know, for redundancy, but also for capacity. So it might be 5, 10, 20, whatever that needs to be, depending on the size and demands of your organization. So that's where users actually log on to. And then the bit I want to pay a little bit more attention to is the final piece, which is the RDS gateway and connection brokers. So these are the roles that basically bring in, that act as the sort of well, one obviously is the connection broker, which gets the connections from your end users, which are coming from either inside or outside of your network, and then distributes them across your remote desktop host, tell the users which host to actually use. And then obviously the gateway is used to host the certificates, and obviously they need renewing every year, every other year, whatever it is, depending on your sort of requirements. And these servers obviously need managing and monitoring and patching and all that sort of stuff, and they need ports opening to allow people to connect through the Azure firewall to come in through into your hosts. So yeah, they're typically at least 2 servers. A lot of the time it's 4, again, for that sort of redundancy as well. So it's a much sort of more complex infrastructure to manage. And typically the way users would access this sort of an environment, there's a few ways that's done. One is if you don't want to open up your RDS gateway servers or connection brokers to the internet directly, you would basically use a VPN. So you would block all the ports, so you wouldn't allow any outside traffic in, and you only allow users to connect through VPN, which one means you've got something else to manage. Also, your users have actually got something else that they need to connect to. Secondly, if you wanted to open up your RDS servers to the internet, probably, which isn't necessarily recommended, if you were to do it, the best way to do it would be to put some other mechanism in place to prevent any sort of brute force attacks, which is some sort of multi-factor authentication solution. And to do that with RDS, you need to then build additional servers to either host a third-party MFA solution or to host like a Radius server to use the Microsoft Azure Active Directory MFA. So it just becomes a lot more complicated to do that. And then obviously the third option is just to basically allow public access, but only by the IP address that you specify, so from your offices or your VPN clients even. So yeah, it just becomes a little bit more complex and insecure ultimately in some respect, because you are going to have to open your environment up in some way, shape or form. So that's the overview of a typical sort of RDS architecture. And then on the next slide, what we're going to do is just got to look at how an Azure Virtual Desktop architecture would look at a very sort of high level, and why this would be beneficial to use, I suppose. So first of all, we still have the same requirements. We still need to actually authenticate. So we recommend when we build out these environments, we still use Azure, a domain controller, or typically multiple domain controllers, and they're usually synchronized with Azure Active Directory. So we've got a single sign-on for the users. But you still need some sort of identity, so a domain controller would be necessary typically. But then also you need somewhere to store your user profiles, and the solution that's supported really is a technology called FSLogix for profile storage, and it basically contains the whole user profile, including all the settings, into like a VHD file, and then you need somewhere to store it in the same way that you need somewhere to store your RDS profiles. But the beauty of Virtual Desktop is it actually supports using Azure file storage, which is a platform as a service offering, whereby you won't need to build a virtual machine or a cluster of virtual machines, and therefore your management overhead is massively reduced because you're just using a platform as a service storage mechanism to store your user profiles. So straight away there's a benefit both from an uptime, from a management perspective. Then again, you still would have in Azure, you'd have your application servers depending on what you need. Again, web servers for your application, any sort of backend servers, database servers, whatever those are, would still need to be hosted in Azure, because once your front end of your applications are installed on your virtual desktop hosts, which is the next piece, then there obviously your virtual desktop host would need something to serve and need something to connect to, and that they would obviously connect to your application servers. So virtual desktop hosts, you can have, again, multiple of these, and we'll go into more detail on one of the other slides later on around the options for these, but same again, the amount of these and the type that you would require would depend on the demands of your applications and the size of your user base ultimately. So one of the big differences though is obviously you can see here is that we don't have any sort of gateway or connection broker services, because that again is all sort of platform as a service from Azure. So you don't need to publish an externally facing server to actually bring users in the environment. That's all done by Microsoft, by the Microsoft Azure virtual desktop service. Users literally would just log in, use their Azure Active Directory login, and then it would recognize the part of your organization and serve them your applications and your virtual desktop hosts. So we'll touch on that a little bit on the next slide, from the user experience. So what's different from the user experience, I suppose, or what's good about the user experience? Well, the first one is what we touched on there. They've got the user single identity. So a lot of your users already will be using Office 365 and Azure AD credentials, and Azure Virtual Desktop also would utilize that. So one of the main benefits of that is the fact that it will integrate with Windows Hello, which is becoming a much more sort of utilized technology. So that identity would utilize that, would utilize Windows Hello, but also because you're using your Azure AD logon and not necessarily your Active Directory logon, although those two things might be synchronized, you actually authenticate against Azure Active Directory, which then means you can utilize products such as conditional access to provide extra security layer for your users accessing the virtual desktop application. So basically your virtual desktop environment is open to the internet, but then you would use conditional access to say, for example, if it's one of our computers, we're happy for the user to go straight in without any further sort of layer of security. If they're coming from a machine we don't recognize, then we want to MFA them just to make sure it's not a sort of a brute force attempt of any sort, and you can use conditional access to really sort of control the security and the access to that. So that's the benefit from an identity perspective. Then you've got the Office 365, obviously integration and performance. So virtual desktop, Microsoft's done a lot of work with really making sure Office 365 performs just like it would on your local machine. And they've done this one by making all the Office 365 settings, search functionality, OST files, all stored in the user's profile, which would then be part of this VHDX file, which would then be written back to the Azure Files container. But then a really big sort of innovation that's happened is the ability to use Teams voice and conferencing. It's actually formally supported by Microsoft on the virtual desktop environment, and that's a really big one for customers that we've worked with, because the one thing that people did need to come out of their remote desktop sessions for a lot of the time, or virtual desktop sessions for, is to use their VoIP or phone system. But now with Teams voice and Teams conferencing support in virtual desktop, users can stay within that one single environment for pretty much all of their requirements. It still supports remote app and full desktop, so you don't have to publish a full desktop to your users. You can just publish specific applications, your ERP application, for example, to users, and they can launch that from the server, and it looks and feels like they're using their they're just using the application on their machine, but obviously it's running on the virtual desktop environment. One of the benefits with that though is now that users have got OneDrive installed in SharePoint on their machines, OneDrive can also automatically sign in the background as part of their virtual desktop session. So users can sort of pull files, export files between their sessions and their applications into their local session. It just integrates automatically. So that's a really good feature. And obviously the virtual desktops can use Windows 10 operating system, and I think I'd say probably 85% of our customer base use Windows 10 as their operating system in there, which obviously previously you could use remote desktop with like a Windows 10 skin or a Windows skin on it, but it wasn't. It was actually a server operating system, whereas now it can actually be Windows 10. So the other thing that we've got is client availability, which I want to touch on, but I'll touch on that shortly. But I'm just going to quickly show you what the difference is for a user actually accessing Windows Virtual Desktop from their machine. So what I've got here, you can see there we've got an icon, which would be a typical sort of remote desktop icon, just to show you what that would look like, obviously previously. And now what we're doing is we're launching the new remote desktop app, which is used for Azure Virtual Desktop. And you can see the user doesn't have to put any URL in, and literally just click subscribe. It'll then pop up, ask them to log in, and you'll recognize this box here. It's the Office 365 Azure AD authentication pane. They'll log in with their user account. It'll recognize what organization they're a part of and offer them the applications that you've got published to them. Again, obviously we can see there's the applications that the user's got, the full desktop, the individual apps. And yeah, those are basically the applications that are offered to that particular user. So I'll just show you what it looks like if you want to actually launch a full desktop session for that user now. So once that populates, shows you the full desktop, they would launch the desktop from their machine. And you'll see there, it's going to pull through their FS Logix profile with all their settings in, connect it to that host that they're logging into, and then you'll see it'll just provide the user with a full Windows 10 desktop session. Yeah, so there you go. You can just see that now. It's just a normal Windows 10 desktop that they can access, and accessing that in the cloud. And obviously, any settings that changes are made will all be written back to the profile when they log off, and then picked up regardless of which host to log on to next time. You see Microsoft Teams loading. Again, that works because of the low latency network that Azure's got in place. So that was just a sort of a very brief look at how the user would connect and what that experience would look like, just for those of you that haven't actually seen it. But the big one for me was the fact that you don't need to actually configure anything on the user side in terms of what URL they need to point to. All they need to do is log in with their account. Microsoft will recognize what tenant they are and point them to your Windows Virtual Desktop. So the other question really is sort of where can our users actually access this application from, or access Windows Virtual Desktop from? And the answer is pretty much any device, because the worst case is they can actually access it from their web browser, which obviously is from pretty much any device out there. So there is applications for Mac and for Android and for Windows, obviously remote desktop apps that you can use, but you can actually also access the application through your web browser, which I'm just going to show you now on the screen. So again, you don't have your own sort of custom web browser or web URL, configured. You use the Microsoft standard one. The user will be asked to log in using their Office 365 credentials, and you can see there's your applications in the web browser. But the real sort of beauty of this is what I'm going to show you now is the user can actually use their applications within the web browser, so not just launch them and then have to run them. They can actually just log in the web browser and navigate the desktop within the browser as well, but also any third-party applications that are published as well. So it's really useful if users not got their work machine with them, but they do need to get on and from maybe it's a home machine or some other computer that they're not normally accessing on. They can get in and they can do some sort of essential work through the web browser, and you'll see here the desktop experience within the browser now. So you can see there we're still within Microsoft Edge, and you can see the full desktop. It's very responsive as you click around, just as it would be on a normal session. But that's all happening within the browser, which is a really sort of useful feature from a mobility perspective, and just to keep a really flexible solution for your users. And again, going back to sort of conditional access, we can configure it to say if a user is coming from a machine that we don't know, we can obviously put MFA in front of them and just give us that extra level of security, you know, so we're more comfortable with providing these more remote flexible solutions for our users. So that's sort of the user side and what the benefits are from there and what that looks like. But let's talk a little bit about the sort of management and what, from an IT sort of architectural perspective, a few points that I think will be really useful for people to know. So the first one is virtual desktop supports both a single session and a multi-user session mode. And what that means is you can build virtual desktop hosts that would support your user sessions, but you can, for certain users, if they're using really demanding applications, such as maybe CAD, like some sort of CAD application or some application that requires a lot of dedicated resource, you can actually spin those users like their own virtual machines up, where only they would be accessing them virtual machines in Azure, and they'd have a dedicated virtual machine just for their usage. Obviously, that'll be more expensive, but it is definitely possible. But also, you can have what's more commonly used in our experience, anyway, is the multi-user session. But you can mix and match these. But the multi-user session basically is a little bit like what RDS would do. Users can log on, it'll pull in their FS Logix profile with all their settings in, and multiple users can log on the same host and share resources on there, and it can basically scale and use the same sort of use the same resources. But you can set limits in there as well, so you can set a session limit, say how many users do you want maximum to be on that host as well, just to make sure that you're managing your capacity. Containerized profiles, for those that don't know really what that means, it's using FS Logix, and that's where it uses a full VHD profile or VHDX profile container, which means that it's not just the profile means more than just the user's files and desktop favorites, that sort of stuff. It's the full user's user hive really, which is all of their application settings, all of their Outlook files and OneDrive files. It's all of their search settings and cache, everything's all in there. So it's their full settings that are going to be moved around regardless of which host they log on to. There's a couple of really useful features for resource optimization to make sure you're only using the resource you need. So you can basically set the virtual desktop host to use two sort of methods of load balancing. So you can use sort of like depth, what's known as depth first, where the first user would log on to the first host, the second user would also log on to that first host until you've reached the capacity of that first host, and then you can use a feature called Start and Connect for, say you've got an 8 user session limit on your virtual desktop host. For the 9th user, you can use Start and Connect. Once that 9th user comes on, the next host would then spin up and start only when that user wants to log in, and then it would be ready to take more sessions for more users. So it's designed to really make sure that you're only paying for what you're actually using from a virtual desktop host perspective. Image management is always a big one for RDS environments or any sort of virtual desktop environment. So Azure supports really simplified image management, where you can build your virtual desktop host, install all your applications, configure anything that you want to be customized on that virtual desktop host, and then you can sysprep it, take a snapshot image within the Azure portal, store it in the Azure portal, and then you can basically build new hosts straight off that image, so you can get you can get a consistent experience for your users and save time in deployment. You know, if you need to scale up, it makes it a lot easier to do that. Security, we've spoke about these things really briefly, but the fact that it integrates with Azure Active Directory is huge. You know, it means that you can manage the virtual desktop host using Intune. You can integrate with conditional access, keep that single identity, move more of your identity to authenticate against Azure AD rather than on-premise Active Directory. And then obviously the other part was from a networking perspective. Microsoft used like a reverse connectivity method, so that you basically just direct all of the users using the app straight to their sort of inbound like connection namespace, and they'll basically route within the Azure data centers your traffic over to your virtual desktop host and to your tenant. So you don't actually need to put any of your application servers or your virtual desktop host to face the internet directly. Microsoft will take care of that for you. So therefore our attack surface is much reduced. The management panel is going to show you a little bit inside there because there's some really useful diagnostics for your virtual desktop here, so you can see on the screen now like what it actually looks like if you want to sort of what information you've got available to you. So you can see number of users that have connected, how many connections were successful, right down to the user level, which user had connection, how many successful connections, which had less, what your latency is for those users connected, what their sessions are, the latency for each of those user sessions, your host performance statistics in terms of CPU, average amount of users on that host, page file information, you know, any FS logic errors and problems, all in this one place. You can even see down here on the left which applications are actually causing the most delay for the users when they're actually running them. So this will show all your user specific applications and show which ones are actually causing the most latency for your user experience. So yeah, that was just sort of a quick look at the type of information. There's a lot more in there, but just with the limited time that we've got here today, you know, it's just to give you a bit of an idea of what type of stuff is available. The key point there was you've just got so much information there, all in one place around the different components, the storage, the host, the FS logics, all that information is brought together in one place so you can monitor and make sure your environment's functioning effectively. So licensing and costs, that's probably one of the big questions around this solution. How does it actually work from a pricing model? And how do you know if you're licensed correctly for it? So the first part, yeah, licensing, you obviously need a license that supports virtual desktop and allows you to actually use that service. And you can see on the screen the licenses that do support it. So E3, 365, E3, E5, A3, E5, F1, the business premium even, which is a big one across our sort of SME customers use that supports virtual desktop and licenses it. The Windows 10 enterprise license from an E3, either E3 or E5 version of that will support the virtual desktop. You can buy a VDA license individually if you haven't got any of the above licenses to license use just a virtual desktop. But you can also use your RDS cards if you've got software assurance, but that is only if you're actually using virtual desktop hosts that are running a server operating system rather than a Windows client operating system. So first step is you need to make sure you've got some form of license to use the service. The second sort of major part around the cost is the infrastructure components, which is basically what your Azure environment is made up of to provide the solution. The main parts of that are your virtual machines for your hosts, and obviously you need some virtual machines for your application servers, depending on what those are. You'll need some storage for your profiles and for your user profile containers, which is the Azure files, which is what we typically recommend. And then you need bandwidth going in and out of the Azure data center, which is very low cost, but it is a cost that you need to be aware of, and you need to make sure it's built into your calculations. But what we have got is we've got obviously historical data for the amount of customers that we've dealt with doing this, implementing this product, and the variation really is anywhere from £8 to £23 per user per month for the user to be using a sort of virtual desktop service. That's what we found. That is a big variation, understandably, but the use cases in scenarios that we deal with our customers also varies greatly in terms of the performance of applications. You know, if you've got someone on a simple data entry tasks, they'll be closer to the £8 per user. With that, and that cost is basically all of those things combined: the VM, the storage, the bandwidth, up to customers who maybe use more like we've got like customers who are like architects who use more CAD type applications, which when we'll be closer up to the upper end, which is like the £23 per user per month. But yeah, just to clarify, that's the cost from Microsoft. It's not necessarily our cost. It's the Microsoft cost, and that is basically just the calculation of the different components that you would need for the users.